DJ Defco and DJ Echo for this interesting exchange of views, and rest assured that the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Committee on Development will continue to follow closely the situation in Ethiopia and the neighboring countries. Colleagues, we move on to item number 8, and let me inform DEVA colleagues who are still connected, but of course they are welcome to also follow this item. We are dealing with another country in Africa, which is of large importance for us. So the item number 8 is an exchange of views with the European External Action Service on the situation in Tanzania after the elections. Bernard Quentin, the Deputy Managing Director for Africa at the European External Action Service, will stay with us also for this item until 12 o'clock. We also have again with us Mr. Hans Stausboll, Head of DJ Defco's Unit for East Africa and the Horn of Africa, who is also available to answer possible questions. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Tanzania elected on the 28th of October a new president, members of the parliaments of the Union and Zanzibar, as well as local councillors. The incumbent president, Mr. Magufuli, won 84% of the vote. However, there are serious allegations that opposition candidates didn't benefit from a level playing field during the electoral process. Moreover, there are reports of irregularities and violence. Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, has asked for investigations into allegations of human rights violations before, during, and after the elections. Mr. Tundu Lissu, Tanzania's opposition presidential candidate, has left the country. He is currently in Belgium, and I had the opportunity to speak to him on the phone this morning. Therefore, I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Quentin to give us an update how the European Union sees the situation in Tanzania. Mr. Quentin, I would like to give you the floor for 10 minutes, and afterwards, interested colleagues can take the floor either by raising the hand button or indicating in another way that you would like to ask questions. So, Mr. Quentin first, and then Mr. Stausboll, if you want to add something. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before touching upon the electoral matters, we do think it important to quickly replace Tanzania in its broader context in the region and its relation with the EU. Tanzania enjoys indeed peaceful relations with neighbors, and engagement should be maintained. Tanzania prides itself in its peaceful history, and this legacy framed within a careful narrative dating back to Nyerere's leadership. Tanzania is a member of SADC, EAC, and also ICGLR. It has not shown an intense commitment to the multilateral initiatives as at other moments in the past. It is in everybody's interest that this engagement is maintained. Regional security cooperation is very important, for example, also with Mozambique, vis-à-vis the recent spillover of violence in the Cabo Delgado region. Traditional friction with Kenya, seen as economic and more successful competitor, has never gone beyond a safe threshold. Uganda is a relatively minor economic partner, but Museveni has never stopped paying respect to the 1979 Liberation War legacy. Rwanda is a more sensitive neighbor, but Tanzania's cooperation with Burundi, including with the new government, is important. It goes far beyond the relation with its neighbors. Tanzania is indeed an important contributor of peacekeepers in UN missions around the world, a little bit less than 2,000 people on the ground in August 2020, notably in Africa, Eastern DRC, Central African Republic, South Sudan, but also in Lebanon. Let me now tackle the electoral issue in mainland and Zanzibar. The campaign was mostly peaceful, and opposition was able to campaign, including the main leader, Tundu Lissu. But There were some incidents with the implementation of security and logistic provisions and a careful monitoring by electoral bodies that led to temporary suspension and fines for some candidates. The main problem was the absence of the level playing field, as the party in power, CCM, was so much stronger and better organized as incumbent, and with better access to institutions and to financial and legal means. The restriction on media freedoms and some activists over the previous months and years also affected the opposition, although all leaders were present and some of the media. Election results. Out of 264 elective seats at the National Assembly, 256 went to the party in government, Shamasha Mapinduzi, CCM. In Zanzibar, out of 50 elective seats at the House of Representatives, 46 went to CCM. Although the multi-party system established in 1992 remains in place, the result put CCM in a position of total control of the Parliamentary Assembly. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, President Magufuli was re-elected with more than 84% of votes, and Dr. Mwinyi was elected President of Zanzibar with 76% of votes, while a very credible opposition leader was considered to have worse result than in previous occasions. Participation was 58% according to the official figures, but empirical calculation of different observers rather hinted at 26-27%. The EU expressed its concern about reduced political space ahead of the elections, and in a declaration on 2 November stating, and I quote some part of the declaration of 2nd of November, the EU notes with regret the disruption of social media before, on and after election day, claims of opposition candidates that they did not benefit from a level playing field during the electoral process, as well as the limited possibilities for electoral observation. In Zanzibar, tensions were reported with deadly violence, including allegation of excessive use of force by state organs. The EU encouraged an open, constructive and inclusive dialogue between the government of Tanzania, opposition political parties and civil society, and recognizes peaceful expression of opinion as essential to multi-party democracy and civil freedom. End of quoting. So, the EU has made clear its preoccupation on due process in the run-up and during the electoral process. We have notably regretted that these elections were less transparent than past cycles. Technical electoral observation has been reduced to a minimum, both from international and domestic observers. Unfortunately, the EU never got an answer to our application to deploy an electoral experts mission. The situation in Zanzibar is particularly concerning, and political instability in the archipelago is not a good sign. It is uncertain that a government of national unity or other conciliatory means that had some traction in the past will play out to diffuse tensions and find positive paths. EU-Tanzania relations are cordial, and we insist on regaining new ground for more political dialogue and cooperation. Although there have been no recent session of Article 8 political dialogue, our head of delegation is in contact with Tanzanian authorities and we have sessions for policy dialogue. We would like to strengthen this communication in the future for sure. As the electoral process has consolidated the position of President Magufuli, the EU will take stock of the situation and assess the possibilities of future cooperation with the government and in close coordination with EU member states. We believe there are areas of common interest between the EU and Tanzania. The EU values communication with the authorities and also obviously with all political stakeholders, including the opposition. We also value our work with civil society and the prospect for more economic opportunity in EU-Tanzania relation, as well as the new elements in our political agenda, such as environmental protection and digital economy. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Canton. Hans Stausboll, would you like to add something to what we've heard?
Stausboll, you have the floor. Please press the speak button.
Does it work? Does it work now?
It's okay.
Yes, I think it
speak.
does. Thanks a lot, Mr. President. Very briefly from my side and from the Commission side, obviously the members of the AFET will be aware that the last 2 years we have had a relatively difficult relationship with Tanzania since the expulsion of our head of delegation some years back. And since then we have been struggling a little bit both with the what I would call the political dialogue. There has been several attempts from the side of the EU to reach out to the authorities of Tanzania, and they have not really accepted that invitation for dialogue. We have also been struggling a little bit at our level with the policy dialogue in relation to our programs and our actions that we are funding in Tanzania. This has resulted in the decision to reduce the multi-annual indicative program for Tanzania with 64 million under the 11th EDF, and it also resulted in our decision not to use budget support under the 11th EDF. We had some ongoing programs that we were still implementing, but indeed no new budget support. We will obviously also, together with the member states, when we enter into the programming process for Indiki, take into account the degree of political dialogue and the buy-in we are getting. And I think there are some very early indications that, for instance, the use of budget support will not be an option for us in the coming years in Tanzania unless we see a fundamental improvement in the political dialogue. Also, we are keen to look more into actions that are obviously supporting directly the population of Tanzania, the private sector that Mr. Kantan was mentioning. So the elections is obviously very worrying, but it does also reflect a little bit a general trend we have seen the last 2 years that are of a big concern to us. I stop there, Mr. President.
Okay, thanks to both of you, Mr. Kantan and Mr. Southball. I will now give the floor to members, and we begin with the chairman of the delegation to the ACP-EU Joint Parliamentary Assembly, our colleague Carlos Zorinho. You have the floor, please.
Muito obrigado. No ano passado teve lugar uma revisão política e diplomática das nossas relações com o Tanzânia.
Thank you very much. Last year there was a conclusion that the government was sufficiently committed to improving the human rights situation, and the president also announced that prisoners of opinion would be freed, but unfortunately none of this has taken place. All of our expectations were in vain. We had no international observers for elections. There were candidates who could not run. They were under pressure. Internet access was blocked. Intimidation continued into general elections. There were arrests, both in continental Tanzania and in Zanzibar. Michelle Bachelet called for the liberation of those who'd been arrested and that supposed human rights violations be investigated before the elections. Notably, a series of murders that took place on the 26th of October. There are many elected members of parliament who decided not to be sworn in, and so in reality the parliamentary situation is that there is no opposition, and that means that there is no democracy. In that context, I would like to ask the representative of the EAS to tell us a bit about the evolution of political relations with the Tanzanian government. And I'd also like to ask Mr. Stausball, what does this mean for Europe's aid to this country? How can we help from a European side to improve the situation? Because to keep doing what we've been doing doesn't seem to be enough. Finally, we need to continue to cooperate with the political opposition and support civil society as well as human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you, colleague Zorrinho. I now give the floor for the EPP group to Michael Gahler, and we hope that his technical difficulties have been resolved. I'm calling Michael Gahler.
Ja, hallo.
Mr. Gahler can't be heard, I'm afraid.
No, Michael, I'm very sorry, but we can't hear you. We can only see that you're sitting in a car. Perhaps you can try and connect later on again. I will then move on to our next speaker from the S&D group, Nacho Sanchez Amor, please.
Mr. Sanchez, you have the floor. Can you please press the speak button?
Yeah, okay, it's okay now? Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm very happy to be so aligned with Carlos Zorrinho. The question is, are we going to do something different when an African country starts to be infected by the populist pandemic? And one of the few hopes of stability and prosperity that we had in Africa seems to be going down the drain. Or are we going to just continue business as usual? Because why are we sending electoral observers to spread democracy if these observations have no consequence? And most of all, what are the causes that cause any backtracking in terms of democracy to not have any impact in Europe? We need to ask ourselves the question, if this is a trend, as the representatives of the Commission have said, if it's been a trend for a while, the European reaction cannot just be to observe elections. We need to act before elections so that the elections themselves can have a little bit of credibility. There is one thing that I would like to highlight, and that's the issue of security in the south. For the past year, there was a problem of security in the north of Mozambique that was imported into Tanzania, and it was said that there were jihadist groups carrying out violent Islamist radical actions, and some young people had been sequestered or kidnapped from the north of Mozambique to be indoctrinated into this. But now the impression is different, and it seems that there are attacks in the south of Tanzania. We've heard a lot about this phenomenon. It's been very concerning, and it has taken us a long time to understand that what was going on was purely a terrorist uprising. So I would like to know what is going to change, since we have seen that democracy has fallen down, that there are significant violations taking place. How is our policy towards Tanzania going to change so that we can consider that we are not just an observer, and with this new terrorist uprising in the border between Mozambique and Tanzania, we've taken so long to find out the real nature of the phenomenon that was taking place. I completely agree with Carlos Zorrinho. I want to know more about this situation on the border. Thank you.
Thank you, Nacho Sanchez Amor. I think you've made some very valid points. I will now connect with Michael Gahler again. Second try. I'm calling Michael Gahler.
Yes, hello. Now it should work, I Thank you very much, and thanks for the explanation where we stand. My opinion definitely is what we have seen in Tanzania, this election, it was a travesty of democracy, and it's not the first time. Last time already, I've been in close contact with Chadema, with the opposition, and in between the time as well. They have been under constant pressure. Democracy has been systematically dismantled in Tanzania, and what we see, the result is not surprising. I mean, it's around Lukashenko style, more than 80% results, with all the ingredients that have been hinted at, in which way the opposition was prevented from having a level playing field. Well, not having a level playing field is a bit even harmless in the description. My question is, are we still giving budget support to Tanzania? And if so, are we willing to stop it? In these given circumstances, such a government that is behaving in such a way, they cannot be trusted that they will use the funds that we give into their budget, that they will use it in a proper way. I think if we still give budget support, we should come back to project aid and give it through channels where we can trust it is used for the designed purpose and does not profit those who are performing in such an awful way. And it's not only on election day, but otherwise as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Gala. I believe you have shared very legitimate concerns about the situation in Tanzania, and I'm very sure that our guest speakers from the European External Action Service and DJ Defco will respond. Now, the next speaker on my list is Paulo Rangel. Paulo?
Yes, only front camera.
Paulo,
your camera.
We see your books you're reading.
Yeah.
Not
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you have not only books, but myself. So I'd like to start to say that we naturally are very, very concerned with this huge deterioration of the civic and democratic sphere in Tanzania, and especially with the repression and even the persecution of the opposition politicians. So what I think is that we have to wonder if European Union should not act in such a manner that the funds that are provided to Tanzania could be at stake. How we can grant that these funds are used for the right purpose. This is the main thing. Then, probably I think we should, about this issue of funding and of supporting development in Tanzania, see if we can manage to orientate this aid, or even some suspension of the aid, to get different position from the institutional authorities now. Let me also recall that EPP, but not only EPP, but EPP with a leading role, we have been calling the attention to also the very, very, very serious insurgents in the north of Mozambique, to the regional and even geopolitical and even global threat of Daesh. And I must say that now we have some developments because Tanzania authorities have already acknowledged that these attacks in the borders between Tanzania and Mozambique, they are attributed to terrorists. So I think that we also should encourage the bilateral cooperation and the regional cooperation to face this problem. So European Union should also address this humanitarian crisis, but also geopolitical crisis that we are living in the south of Tanzania and north of Mozambique. The movements in the border are crucial to explain how the situation has been deteriorating all across 2020 and especially in the 2 last months. So I also would like to call your attention to this problem of the North Mozambique and even South Tanzania. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the final request to speak comes from Juliana Zofko from the EPP Group.
Thank you, Chair. My question goes to European delegation. So the European Parliament resolution called for EU to closely monitor the human rights situation in Tanzania, particularly through regular reporting by its delegation, and called specifically for the EU delegation to provide emergency protection and support for human rights defenders. It has come to our notice that human rights defenders have fled Tanzania. What program or actions did the delegation have on the ground to protect human rights defenders in Tanzania? If none, why not? Given the EU Parliament's concern on the deterioration of the human rights in Tanzania and the violence that occurred pre and post the election period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Zofko. And colleagues, if you allow, then I will finally also like to ask a couple of questions to our guest speakers. In preparation of this meeting, I did a considerable amount of reading about the ongoing situation in Tanzania, and I came across that in September this year, Council President Charles Michel committed to provide Tanzania with 27 million euros to combat the effects of COVID. Now, my question is, what were the criteria required from Tanzania to fulfill in order to benefit from aid dedicated to the fight against COVID? Because the regime in Dar es Salaam has announced that apparently the country is corona-free. The government in Dar es Salaam has refused to provide statistics on COVID. The government in Dar es Salaam has refused to follow WHO guidelines and has stated publicly that 3 days of national prayer has saved the country from the pandemic. So what's your take on this? And has the EU delegation addressed these issues? Colleagues, I put this country on our agenda today because I think the developments are very concerning. And as previous speakers have pointed out, we expect the European Union to be very clear and vocal on these unacceptable developments in the country. And I would also like to once again underline that our EU delegation on the ground also has a responsibility to support those brave people who are defending human rights and are fighting for values we hold high in the European Union, and we want them to be global values. So I would like to hear some clear words now from you, Mr. Canton, and also from you, Mr. Stausbol.
Allô? Merci, merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, honourable members, for your comments and your questions. Now, I'm going to try to answer in as much as possible. First of all, I must stress the fact that we could not send a mission of electoral experts to Tanzania. Only the diplomatic missions on the spot could observe. I also want to stress that on this point, it's not just Europe that could not send electoral missions. neither the African Union nor NZ could do it either. So basically, this is something we have had to deplore. On the other hand, we are convinced that we have to go further and to deepen our political relations with the authorities so that we can give a real answers to all the questions that were raised. We need a political dialogue. This is open, it's transparent, and it has to be as frank as possible. Now, this is a dialogue that is ongoing with the government, but there are also permanent contacts with all the political stakeholders. I've already said this, but with the opposition too, as well as civil society, whether it's organized or not. By this I also mean, for instance, the private sector elected in organized civil society, and of course also human rights organizations, as we are already doing. The union is convinced about this, that it is necessary, because you can't have a sustainable democracy without a participative democracy. And we've also been in touch with the whole of civil society, and it's important to see that there was a lack of participation by the population. We have to analyze the causes. I was talking about developing a stable democracy and a participative democracy. Well, there's a lot of work that needs to be done with all our contacts, and we have to see how we can increase participation in the electoral process. As I said earlier, I'm convinced that this has to be done within the framework of a permanent political dialogue. In our first intervention, I spoke of the importance of stability in Tanzania, not only for Tanzania, but for the whole region, because when we look at this region, a question was raised here. It was on the southern border of Tanzania, when looking at the problem of stability in northern Mozambique. Now, we believe the cooperation between Tanzania and Mozambique has improved. The EU has already declared itself to be willing to support this, and it's also in this way that we have to be in political contact with Tanzania. I also, well, I hope I've answered most of your points. You might have questions on COVID. Well, in actual fact, we don't have information or exact information on the number of deaths, on the development of the infection and so forth, but we can base ourselves on other elements. For instance, FMI's projections on the impact of COVID and on the economy of the various countries that are undergoing the epidemic. For instance, for Tanzania, the end of June, the estimate was 5.5% growth. Today, projection is only 1.9%, and we believe that it might drop further. So it's that type of element. If the government doesn't want to take part in the effort of transparency for the epidemic, we can still base ourselves on this kind of element, this kind of point, and not pretend that the country is COVID-free. Thank you.
Mr. Stausboll, would you like to add something?
Yes, I would indeed, Mr. President, and I will try to use clear language. We hope we always use clear language, but I will do my best in this situation. There was a number of questions related to the financial cooperation, and I will try to respond to that. Maybe starting with the point of Mr. Rangel about the possibility of suspend altogether the financial cooperation, and indeed, as the members will be aware, in order to do that, we would have to apply the Article 96 of the Cotonou Agreement, which is being used relatively rarely and that we felt was not justified to do in the Tanzanian context at this stage. As I mentioned in my introduction already, we did nevertheless since 2018 take into account the problems we were confronted with. First of all, I mentioned that we decided already at that stage not to process any new budget support operations, and I hope that responds to the question of Mr. Gala. We are not, since 2018, we have not approved any new budget support operations, and our intention is, at least in the first part of the next financial perspective, not to use budget support. I have to admit there were some ongoing budget support operations which were not suspended, and indeed some payments were made in 2020. That is clear. Mrs. Sonka asked a question about support for human rights defenders, and indeed we do have the instrument in place. We have used it in Tanzania, but of course our possibilities for protecting human rights defenders, apart from the political support we can give, is relatively limited in terms of funding their expenses and these type of things. If a government is hell-bent on trying to get rid or make it difficult for these defenders to operate, there is relatively little we can do operationally. But indeed, the EU and its member states did take actions, and I think one of the opposition politicians was indeed evacuated thanks to the EU. There was a general question from both Mr. Sorinho and also Mr. Sanchez. Are we going to change our policy, and how can we use aid to achieve our political objectives and uphold our fundamental values? Already since 2018, we did decide to reallocate some of the programs towards more support for civil society, and also give less attention to programs that were directly implemented by the government. But it is clear in a country like Tanzania, unless the government agrees to what we are funding, it is very difficult to do. It is also clear that the threat of suspension and the financial cooperation at the end of the day has a relatively limited leverage in a country like Tanzania. So if we believe that by threatening to withdraw 100 million euro we can gain political influence, I think that is not a realistic expectation. What we will have to do for the future is obviously to have a discussion with our member states, and this process have already started. What are the implications, both in terms of the overall allocation of assistance to Tanzania, and notably what is it we should be doing? How can we support better civil society? Can we do more to support directly the private sector? These type of reflections, that is obviously something we will have to go through. And we are already starting that process with the member states. On the specific question on the COVID response, obviously we are as appalled as you are about the reaction of the government. Obviously there is COVID in Tanzania, and the support that was provided was not in the form of budget support. It is in the form of activities that can actually help the people who are affected. I do not have the latest detail here, Mr. President, on what we are actually financing and where we are, but that can be provided to the committee if you want us to do that. The final point from the President about what is the EU delegation to uphold the fundamental values and protect human rights defenders, I can assure you that our colleagues on the ground are doing whatever they can in a very difficult circumstances. And indeed, the fact that we had a head of delegation who was expelled in 2018 because he was insisting on the fundamental values does illustrate the problem under which we are operating in Tanzania. But as said in my early introduction, we are concerned about the general situation in Tanzania, and I think for us, business as usual cannot be the approach we will follow. I'll stop there.
Thank you, gentlemen. To conclude, I want to make a couple of more remarks. The EU-Tanzania programme 2014 till 2020 prioritised good governance, which included the protection of human rights, non-discrimination and freedom of speech. And what we have been seeing since 2015 is a downward spiral. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty and civil society organisations in the country are telling us that the situation hasn't improved. We're in a downward spiral. So given this evidence, I can only call on us all in the European Union that we cannot continue as we are doing with Tanzania. We cannot continue this kind of policy. I think we have to pay more attention to the country, and that especially financial support has to be questioned. And I do have a further question for you, Mr. Canton, because your answer to my question wasn't, I think, that far-reaching. Once again, I would like to ask you, the European Union granted 27 million euros of European taxpayers' money to Tanzania to combat the effects of COVID. Now, we have a regime in the country saying that there is no COVID in the country, with rather bizarre explanations. So once again, we have a government who's refused to follow guidelines from the World Health Organization, a government that has refused to provide statistics, and still we're giving them 27 million euros. I would like you to inform the members of our committee about the money we have given to Tanzania, what were the criteria for giving this money, and especially what is happening with this money. We are talking about European taxpayers' money, and I have difficulties that we grant money to a government which is obviously not trying to cooperate in a decent manner. So could you please answer my question? And if you're not able now, then I would expect you to provide us the written details within 48 hours. Thank you. The floor is yours, Mr. Canton.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I hear your questions and I take good note of them. As my colleague from the Commission has said, I'm unable to give you all of the details right now on the way in which the 27 million were calculated and how they are allocated, but I do understand your concerns in that respect, and the disparity between the political posturing of the government and our attempts to deal with what we believe to be the reality on the ground. You did suggest that I could give you a written answer in 24 hours. I can commit to doing that, and I will give you all of the details that you require in answer to your question in writing. Thank you.
Mr. Canton, colleagues, we have no interpretation, but I have one more request to take the floor. Is that correct? So we will continue in English. Oh, no, okay. Thank you, Mr. Canton. First of all, thanks for providing the information. I think we really need to have a closer look at this. And I would also like to underline that we will continue following the situation in Tanzania in this committee too, like we are following the situation in many other countries. But it's interesting if you start digging into what's actually happening with European money in African countries, you start to raise questions. And I think these questions need to be thoroughly answered in full detail, because we are responsible for the effective spending of European taxpayers' money. So I would like to thank you, Mr. Canton and Mr. Stausboll, for attending this meeting. I would like to thank colleagues for asking very interesting questions. I will close the meeting now, and we will resume at 4:45, then with a session on the situation in Serbia and Montenegro. Thank you.